Hi everybody, welcome back to my second week of doing a live stream Bible study. So last week I mentioned that today I would be starting a part series of what does it mean to bear God's name, and I'm gonna do that. So all of this started when I was talking with a friend. This Bible study particularly came about because I was talking to them about God's name, and they insisted that they were going to use the name Jehovah. And I said, and this was not like a me just saying like, oh, by the way, that's not the name, but we were talking about the name, and they were like, oh, I like to use Jehovah even though it's not the real name. They knew it wasn't the real name, and so I said, well, why? And they said, because I bear God's name, and what that really means is that I have the A name that represents His qualities, and it doesn't matter if it's Jehovah or Yahweh. What matters is that it represents Him and His qualities, which I kind of thought was circular reasoning because this comes from somebody who takes great pride in using the name, but then they don't actually use what scholars call as the real name. So this particular person, they like to call out or complain about other Christian denominations because like, well, they don't use God's name. But then when I pointed out that they're not using God's name, they were like, well, that doesn't count. So I decided to do a Bible study on it because what does it mean to bear God's name? That's a very valid question. And if you're a Christian, who's especially somebody who claims to bear God's name, that's a really important thing to know. So the question I started out asking was, does bearing God's name mean using the actual name, or does it mean talking about His qualities with people? Because that's what they were implying, and so I decided to look into it. And for what it's worth, I still support using the actual name. And the reason I do support using the actual name is because, so say you're like, I'm a scientist, so say that I won a Nobel Prize in physics, and I get there, and I'm on the stage, and they announce my name, and they call me Carolyn. I would feel like a deflated balloon, because my name isn't Carolyn, it's Caroline. And, you know, that actually happened to me at my graduation from college. They called me Carolyn, and I actually messaged them, I emailed them before the ceremony and said, please call me Caroline. It's not Carolyn, it's Caroline. And they still called me Carolyn, and I was really upset. Now, obviously, God is a little bit more sophisticated than I am, but I still think anybody would want, if they're going to be recognized for their achievements, they would want it to be attached to their real name. So I think that God would want the same, or at the very least, I'm going to follow the Bible principle of doing unto others what I would want done unto me. And if I would want people to not just recognize my achievements, but to get my name right when I'm there, I'm going to do the same thing for God. So I'm going to use the name that we can say is the closest, which is Yahweh. But when I started this study, it ended up becoming something so much bigger than what I thought it was going to be. I thought this was going to be a one-time, like, simple thing. It wasn't. And some of my sources, particularly one source in particular, which is a book called Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, by Carmen Imes, that one truly took me down a rabbit hole. And what I realized is that the question of bearing God's name spans from the very beginning with Adam and Eve all the way through today. And so where do we start? We're going to start with a choice. When you're bearing the name of God, you got to choose to do it. This is why God gave us free will. If God just wanted blind support from his followers, he would not have allowed Adam and Eve to eat that fruit, but he did, because they had to choose to follow him. But this choice isn't just, well, do we want to be Christian or not? It actually goes so much deeper than that. So let's start with Adam and Eve. They had a choice. So they were told the first lie from Satan, and the lie was, this fruit, you will not die. Eat this fruit, you're not going to die. God isn't, he's wrong. And we have to imagine Eve's confusion. She's the one that really got told this lie. So kind of have to imagine her confusion up to that point. Because back then, she had lived in a paradise on earth with her perfect husband for whom she was made, literally. And everything was kind of given to them. They had anything that they wanted to eat. They could just grab it and eat it. Sure, they had work to do in the garden, but it was fun. They were tending the garden and it worked for them, and that was great. And they had a personal relationship. They met God face to face. And they had never heard anything that contradicted this basic life that they were living. And I say basic, and I mean, this is before all the drama started. And then the serpent comes along and tells them, no, you can eat this fruit. But God had told them before that they couldn't or they would die. But now the serpent is telling them that they can. They had no reason to think anything bad of the serpent up until that point. They had no reason to think anything was wrong with the picture. That changed when the serpent lied to them. So their confusion is understandable. But we have to look at the choice. I'm not saying their choice was excusable. We have to look at the choice for what it was really about. Satan wasn't trying to get Adam and Eve to eat the fruit because he thought that this was a tasty treat that shouldn't be denied to them. He was trying to get them to eat the fruit because it wasn't actually about the fruit. It was the one rule that they had, and he was trying to get them to break it. It's not about the fruit. It's about their choice being, do I trust my Creator who told me not to eat this fruit? Do I allow him and his words to guide my next decision? Or do I trust my own judgment? Do I see for myself? So the question wasn't, should I eat the fruit or not? The question was, should I trust God or not? And we obviously know how that turned out. But our choice today isn't that much different from theirs. Now, obviously, they made a decision that changed the whole world. Ours is not going to change the entire world. By choosing to be a Christian, we're not going to change the entire world for everybody, but we will change the world for ourselves. It is just as important a decision. They were choosing between life and death, and so are we. So when you make a decision like this, if you're pondering, am I going to be bearing God's name? You need to think about that and how deep it is. This isn't a question on whether or not we're going to be a Christian. This is a question of whether or not we're going to trust our Creator. The Jehovah's Witnesses actually have a theory that this is about sovereignty. This is about God's right to rule. And I agree with that to an extent. This is a decision about whether we're going to allow God to rule us. That's where you start it, but that's not the end of it. Because this decision, say you come to the conclusion, you know what, yeah, I'm going to be bearing God's name. Great. That's not the end of it. That's the beginning. So, to emphasize what I mean by that, I'm going to go into the story of Moses. So Moses today, we know he was God's dear friend. They spoke face to face. God truly loved him. These things we all know, but this is the part of the story we want to focus on. Moses, as great as a prophet as he was, and he is remembered as the greatest prophet, he still didn't get into the promised land. So I want to say Deuteronomy, but I'm probably wrong. I should have written down the scripture. The Israelites are wandering in the forest, or the wilderness, really, and they're running out of water, and they're complaining for water, and this has happened, like, how many times? God has led them into this wilderness to provide for them, to show them that he is trustworthy. And they still freak out when they don't get water, as if God isn't going to provide that for them. Now, I'm going to talk about that more next week, about why it's understandable why they would act that way, just the way it's understandable why Eve would be confused. But Moses got fed up, and God was patient. He said, give them water, strike the rock, and give them water. Moses did strike the rock, and he did give them water, but he did not do it in an appropriate way. He called them out for their bad behavior, and he made it out as if he was bringing the water out of the rocks, if he and Aaron were doing it, not that Yahweh was providing it for them, but that they were doing it. And God's, that's not cool, man. You're not going to get into the promised land because of this. This story kind of brings up 2 points when it comes to bearing God's name. And the first is that the decision to bear God's name is a commitment. No matter how tired or hungry or angry or frustrated or happy you are, you still have to uphold this commitment. Moses had to, and he made a failure, and therefore he had this very special reward taken away from him. But the second point about it is that this commitment is binding whether or not you were promised a reward. Did Moses just pack up? God says you're not going to get into the promised land because of this. Did Moses say, you know what, that I'm not going to be your prophet anymore? No, he continued working. And that's because the real reward, Moses knew this, the real reward was this lasting, loving relationship. Yahweh didn't cut him off. Yahweh said, we can still be friends, bro, but you're not going into the promised land. So when you're making this commitment to God, you are making the decision to follow through with this promise. I'm going to uphold your name. Therefore, this is a commitment. What does that mean? So I read an article called Bearing the Name of God by George P. Van Pupta online. You can literally Google it. It's like the first search result. And he says, you have a responsibility to guard that name. Now he starts out by saying when you're baptized, you are adopted into God's family and you are given this name. You're given God's name as a gift. That is true. But what does it mean? What does he explains it further, but what does it mean when you say now you have a commitment, you have a responsibility? You have a responsibility to guard the name, so that means you should act in a way that does not bring reproach upon the name. The Bible says that people are watching. People do watch. I mean, every Christian knows that when people know that you're a Christian, they are judging you. They are looking at you. They want to know, in essence, people look for you to mess up. Why do we think that churches like the Westboro Baptist Church are so well renowned? It's because they do things that even other Christians are like, what the heck? Why are you doing that? It's inappropriate. Their behavior is inappropriate. And the reason that everybody knows who they are is because of this behavior. If they were acting appropriately, they wouldn't have a reason to be called out. But we do have examples of Christian people who are called out for their good behavior. Didn't write any down in my notes because I didn't foresee this conversation turning this way. But I have a personal example of Christians that I have called out for being good people. That's my parents-in-law. When I was struggling and I was scared and I needed help, they were there for me. They opened their home to me. And they didn't do this because, oh, you're dating our son, so we're just gonna. They did this because they're Christians and they care. And they saw this as an opportunity to be warm, welcoming, loving people. So they took it. And they didn't ask for anything in return. I mean, they did ask that I clean up after myself. That's pretty standard. But they didn't tell me I was in debt to them just because they were opening up their home, and they didn't treat me awful, and they were understanding and caring. They supported me. But not only that, they were there for me mentally. When I needed somebody to talk to, they were there. And that is something that can't be even named. I mean, there's just the support and the love that they gave, and they did it. I can't say that they're bad people, that they wouldn't have done it if they weren't Christians, but I definitely think that being Christian helped them make the decision to help me. And I really, really think that that's a good thing. They showed true love. So by their actions, they are bearing God's name. I can't complain about them. And if I was going to complain about their actions, that would be a reflection on their God. But because they were good, they appropriately bore God's name, I have good things to say about them and their faith. And this all kind of comes back to you're giving a witness to the nations around you. You're giving a witness to the people around you as a Christian. And bearing God's name involves that. That is the essence of bearing God's name, is that you, by your actions, are showing what and who God is. And then, furthermore, in bearing God's name, you ask him to direct your decisions and thought processes. So there are a lot of self-help books out there, and I've heard many parents complain that children don't come with training manuals, which is true. But when you become a Christian and you're bearing God's name, now is the time where you're gonna have a standard of living. You're gonna have a guide to live by, and that's the Bible. Now, a lot of things in the Bible might feel outdated. For instance, some of the rules in the Old Testament were definitely outdated. They have rules about the house, the roof of the house needing to have a wall around it. And there is a good reason that they had those kinds of rules, because the roof of the house used to be a part of the living area. You actually used to be able to go onto your roof. It was flat and people would hang out up there like a balcony. We don't do that anymore, so we don't need the wall around our roof. But if you have a balcony, you should have a railing there to protect people. But what my point about all of that is that now you have the Bible as a guide. And yes, you're going to have to use reasonable judgment when using the Bible as a guide. For instance, the Bible has advice on marriage. It has advice on practical health decisions. It has advice on raising children. It has advice on growing food. Some of the Old Testament laws included a year of Jubilee, which was a resting year, or a Sabbath year. And farmers actually do that kind of thing today. They only use a field for so many seasons before they have to let it rest. That's a practical thing. Ultimately, the thing about bearing God's name is that you are an ambassador for God. And that means that you are wearing his name on your forehead and everybody can see it. Do you want people to look at you and see something bad about you, about the God you serve. By bearing God's name, you are taking on the responsibility of showing the world who he is. And that might be scary, and that might mean making changes that you didn't ever think you were going to have to make, but it's still an important thing to do. Because even though God doesn't have an entire nation anymore, now he has a planet of a family of people who do bear his name, like you bear your father's name or your name. My name is Caroline. That is the name that I bear. But I also bear my husband's name. And in a way, what I do is associated with him. And what he does is associated with me. If he's rude, people look at me funny. If I'm weird, people look at him funny. So you're in the same kind of, but much deeper version of that kind of relationship with Yahweh God. You bear his name, and what you do reflects upon him. So, are you going to let your actions speak kindly of the God that you serve, that you worship? Are you going to imitate the God that you serve, that you worship? That he does good things, therefore you should too. And I just want to say that this name is not an identity that you can just shed when you're having a bad time. You have to be able to do this, speak kindly, be patient. You have to be able to do those kinds of things even when you're having a bad day, which is hard. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit briefly. I'm coming to the end of my 30 minutes, so I'm going to talk briefly about what I'm going to go over next week, and then I have just a little announcement. So, next week I'm going to get more into the book Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. She talks about the law, and I did not see how the law tied into bearing God's name until I read this book, and it was so fantastic, and I totally recommend you go and you read it. But to kind of build you up for next week, I want you to imagine yourself as an Israel slave. You're in Egypt, you're a slave, your people have been enslaved for 400 years, that's all you know. You're living in harsh working conditions in a ghetto, essentially. And I'm thinking like the ghettos in Poland when the World War II was going on. It was hard. It was nasty. It was really bad standard of living. And they were forced into it. They were treated very badly. And then Moses comes, and he gives you the personal name of God, and he says he's here he is in Yahweh has sent him to fulfill his promise to your ancestors that you would become a great nation. But you're not a great nation, you're a captive nation. And then these plagues happen. And they're absolutely, I'm going to say the word stunning and awesome, but I don't mean in a great way. They're terrifying. And you get to see the power of your God firsthand. And then you go into the wilderness, and you're being chased by these people, and you don't have food, and you don't have water. You ran away with so little time, you didn't even have time to let your bread rise. You had to eat it before it had risen. And then God saves you again by literally parting the sea. And you get to see his awesome power. But then you're supposed to turn into this great nation. But you're just a ragged set of people wandering the wilderness. You gotta feel really intensely like there is no identity to you and your people. And that's scary and sad, and pretty depressing. And then you get the law. So I want you to think about the law in terms of what the individual people were thinking about it when it came to them. They had just seen this amazing power of God. And then Moses came with this law covenant. And you got to imagine how they were feeling. That this is a good thing. A lot of Christians don't think about the law at all, and if they do, they think about it as a set of rules. But that's not the way that the individuals would have seen it. So I'm going to leave that there, because I'm going to get into more details about that next Saturday. But for now, I want to say thank you so much for watching. I really am grateful that I had anybody watch at all and that I get to do this. I do have a website. I'm going to post my article that I wrote with the works cited at the bottom so you can see for yourself what I was looking at. And I found out today that I am not able to live stream from the website from my phone. I have to be on a computer. Now, we have computers here at my house, but today, Saturday, is my husband's day to use the computer. And I'm not going to change that because I told him when I started this Bible study that I wasn't going to change that, so I'm going to stick to my agreement with him. And I'm going to do my live streams from Facebook on my page that I just made this morning. That's called Carol Bible Students. There's a link to the website from there. You can post forum articles if you want. You can make groups. You can have fun on the website. But if you're not interested in that, you can just stick to the Facebook page. I'm just going to come back every Saturday at around 1 p.m. and do a live stream. My other thing is that I'm thinking about starting a Friday movie night in which I would do a streaming service where you share your screen and play a movie. So I would post a link and you would be able to click on the link and go watch the movie, and we would be on a live chat while we do that. And while we were watching the movie, I'm thinking of doing crafting because I like to crochet. I made this hat last Friday. And I have various sewing projects to do. So if that's something that you would be interested in doing, watching a movie with me on Friday nights and doing crafting, that would be excellent. Just leave a comment that says that you would be interested. And let's have some fun with this. Let's make fun times together and enjoy what we do. So, thank you all again, and I'll see you guys next week when we talk about the law and why Christians should pay attention to it. So, thank you. Bye.